The knock at the door. The storm outside had not yet reached its full strength, but the sky had already turned a deep shade of gray, and the wind carried with it the smell of rain. Inside the grand mansion, Daniel Carter stood in his study, staring at the shelves filled with books he never touched anymore, and the trophies of a life that many would envy. Billionaire, visionary, ruthless negotiator, those were the names the world had given him. But here, alone within the marble walls of his estate, none of those names meant anything. He was simply a man haunted by the silence of empty rooms, a man whose heart had long ago hardened to stone after betrayal and loss had carved through him like knives. Wealth had given him everything he once thought mattered, yet it had stolen from him the one thing he could never buy back: peace. The sound that interrupted his thoughts was so soft at first that he thought he had imagined it. A faint knock, carried by the wind, muffled by the storm but persistent enough to draw his attention. Daniel frowned and glanced at the clock. No one came here without notice. His gates were guarded, his staff followed orders, and his life was carefully arranged, so that nothing unexpected reached his doorstep. And yet, the knock came again, louder this time, sharper against the heavy oak door of the mansion. With a sigh that was equal parts irritation and curiosity, Daniel set his glass aside and walked toward the sound, his footsteps echoing across the polished floors. When he pulled the door open, the sight before him froze him in place so completely that the breath seemed to leave his body. Standing there, drenched in the mist of the approaching storm, was a woman he never thought he would see again. Her face was thinner now, her skin dull with exhaustion and streaked with grime, her once beautiful dreadlocks tangled and falling loosely around her shoulders. Her clothes were faded, torn at the sleeves, and her shoes looked as though they had carried her across too many nights of walking with nowhere to go. But it wasn't the weariness in her body or the dirt on her skin that struck him most. It was her eyes. Those eyes, the same ones that had haunted him for 7 long years, still carried the same depth, the same fire, even now when she looked like a shadow of the woman he remembered. Her name fell from his lips in a whisper before he could stop himself. Sasha. She flinched at the sound, but she didn't turn away. Instead, she straightened her back as though forcing herself to stand tall despite the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Beside her stood a boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old. His clothes were dusty, his little shoes nearly worn through, and his small hands clung tightly to her arm. He stared up at Daniel with wide, cautious eyes, the kind of eyes that told stories no child should ever have lived. Stories of hunger, of cold nights, of too many unanswered questions. Daniel's gaze dropped to the boy's thin arms, to the way his ribs pressed faintly against the fabric of his shirt, and something inside him cracked without warning. Sasha's voice was barely above a whisper when it came, raw and trembling, but steady enough to hold his attention. "Can I clean your house for food?" The word struck him harder than any blow. For a moment he could not move, could not even think. Sasha, the woman who had once been his entire world, the woman who had vanished without a word, the woman who had left him with nothing but questions and fury, was now standing on his doorstep begging for food. And worse, she was not begging for herself. Her hand shifted protectively to the boy's shoulder, guiding him closer to her side. Her meaning was clear. She had come for him, for the child. Daniel's hand tightened around the doorframe until his knuckles turned white. The years between them came rushing back in a storm of memory. The late nights filled with laughter, the promises they had whispered to each other when they were young, the dreams they had once shared, and then the emptiness that followed when she had simply disappeared. He remembered searching, calling, waiting for an explanation that never came. And now here she was, standing in rags on his doorstep, asking to trade her dignity for a piece of bread. "Sasha," he finally said, his voice breaking in ways he hated. 7 years. 7 years you vanished without a word. And now you're here, asking to clean my house? She looked down for a moment, her lips trembling, but then she lifted her chin again, her eyes glistening, though no tears fell yet. "I didn't come for you," she said softly, each word cutting like glass. "I came for him." She rested her hand on the boy's small shoulder. He's hungry. Daniel's eyes darted back to the boy, whose wide gaze flickered between them like he was trying to understand a conversation too heavy for his young mind. His name. Daniel wanted to know his name, needed to know who he was. The question slipped out before he could think. What's his name? Malik, Sasha whispered. The name twisted inside Daniel like a knife. A new question rose unbidden, one he was almost afraid to ask. Is he mine? Her head shook quickly, firmly, as though she had prepared for this question. No. He's my nephew. Daniel's mind spun. Her nephew. Not her son, not his child, but still a boy who clung to her like she was the only anchor left in a storm. Where was the rest of her family? Why was she standing here with nothing, offering to scrub his floors for food? Questions pressed against his lips, but before he could voice them, Sasha spoke again. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking now, the tears finally glistening more brightly in her eyes. Just some bread. I'll clean your floors, wash your windows, anything you want. I can't let him go another night without food. The boy tugged softly at her sleeve and whispered in a small voice, I'm okay, Mom. The word wasn't right. She was his aunt, not his mother. But the way he said it, the way he pressed himself against her side, told Daniel everything. For Malik, Sasha was more than an aunt. She was everything. And in that moment, Daniel Carter, the man who had built an empire on cold decisions and ruthless power, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He was no longer staring at the woman who had betrayed him 7 years ago. He was staring at a woman who had carried suffering on her back, who still stood tall in front of a child that wasn't even hers, shielding him from the cruelty of the world. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't know whether to slam the door shut or pull them both inside. The ghosts of the past. The silence that followed Sasha's plea stretched through the hallway like a heavy fog, pressing on every corner of Daniel's chest until he could hardly breathe. The billionaire who was known for making decisions in seconds, for commanding boardrooms with sharp words and cold logic, now stood frozen, unable to move, unable to decide whether to slam the door on the woman who had broken him or to reach for the boy who clung to her side. With frightened eyes, the storm outside pushed harder against the glass windows, the wind howling as though the world itself was demanding he make a choice. Finally, without a word, Daniel stepped aside, his face unreadable, his eyes dark with something Sasha could not name. Pain? Anger? Maybe something else buried deep beneath both. His voice came low, almost strangled. Come in. For a moment Sasha hesitated, her body rigid as though she expected him to change his mind at any second. But the pull of the boy beside her forced her forward. She tightened her grip on Malik's hand and guided him across the threshold into the mansion. The moment her bare, calloused feet touched the cool marble, she felt an ache rise in her chest. The polished floor, the sweeping staircase, the grand paintings on the wall. This was the world she had once known through Daniel. A world she had chosen to leave behind not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Yet stepping inside, again, stripped of pride, stripped of dignity, felt like swallowing fire. Malik's small hand gripped hers tighter as his wide eyes darted across the vast foyer. He had never seen a house like this, never seen ceilings so high or lights that glowed with such warmth. He looked half afraid and half amazed, as though he had just stepped into another universe. Stay close to me, Sasha whispered to him, brushing her fingers through his tangled hair. Her voice was firm, but Daniel caught the way her lips trembled, the way her shoulders hunched slightly as though she was shielding him not just from the cold but from judgment. Daniel turned without another word and led them toward the kitchen. His footsteps were steady, sharp against the marble, while theirs dragged softly behind him. He pulled out 2 chairs at the long table and gestured. Sit. His tone was not cruel, but it carried the weight of command, a tone Sasha remembered well. She lowered Malik into a chair first, brushing a hand against his back as though to reassure him, before sinking into the seat beside him. Her spine stayed straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel moved to the refrigerator, his movements brisk, efficient. He pulled out bread, cheese, fruit, and poured a glass of water. He placed the plate in front of Malik without looking at Sasha. Eat. Malik's small fingers hovered over the bread as though he wasn't sure it was real. His eyes darted to Sasha, searching for permission. She nodded softly. It's okay, baby. Eat. That was all he needed. The boy took a cautious bite, then another, and soon he was eating hungrily, devouring the food with quick, trembling hands. Daniel stood, still watching silently, his chest tightening at the sight of the boy's desperation. It was more than hunger, it was survival. When Malik had slowed enough to sip water between bites, Daniel's eyes shifted to Sasha. His voice came cold, sharp as a blade. Now talk. Her throat tightened, but she nodded slowly. Her eyes stayed fixed on Malik as though drawing strength from the child's presence. Her voice was low, rough from exhaustion. After I left you, they kept me under watch. My brother had gotten into something dark, something dangerous. He thought if he used me, he could get to you. They wanted money, Daniel. They wanted to extort you. Daniel's jaw clenched, the muscles twitching as fury surged beneath his controlled exterior. I had no idea. You weren't supposed to, Sasha said, a bitter smile flickering for only a second before disappearing. When I refused, they threatened your life. They told me if I didn't vanish, if I didn't cut every tie, they'd come for you. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep you safe. Daniel leaned back against the counter, his fists tightening at his sides. For 7 years he had cursed her name in silence, told himself she was selfish, cruel, that she had chosen to walk away because she never cared. He had built walls of ice around his heart just to survive the weight of her absence. And now, with one trembling confession, those walls began to crack. You could have come to me, he said finally, his voice breaking in places he wished it hadn't. We could have fought them together. Sasha shook her head, tears filling her tired eyes. They weren't the kind of people you fight, Daniel. They would have destroyed everything. They would have destroyed you. Her hand moved instinctively to Malik's shoulder, stroking his messy hair. And then my brother. He didn't make it. He left Malik behind. I found him hiding in an abandoned house, terrified and starving. I couldn't leave him. He's all I have left. The boy, still chewing slowly, reached for her hand and gripped it tightly as though afraid she might vanish the way his father had. Daniel stared at the sight, Sasha's gaunt figure, the boy clinging to her, the way she carried his pain as though it was her own, and something inside him twisted painfully. He let out a shaky breath, dragging a hand down his face. All this time, he murmured. All this time you were protecting me and I hated you for it. Sasha's lips trembled as tears slipped down her cheeks. I hated myself too, she whispered. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the soft clink of Malik's fork against the plate, the faint hum of the storm outside. Daniel looked at her again, really looked at her, not the woman who had once lit up every room she entered, not the memory that haunted him, but the woman who sat here now, weary, broken, but still standing. A woman who had chosen sacrifice over survival, who had chosen him once before even when it cost her everything. And for reasons he could not explain, something inside him softened. His voice came quieter now, no longer sharp but steady. You don't have to run anymore. Sasha blinked, startled. What do you mean? I mean, stay here, Daniel said, his eyes flickering between her and Malik. Both of you. You're not sleeping on the streets again. Her breath caught, her lips parting as though to protest. Daniel, I can't ask that of you after everything. You didn't ask, he interrupted firmly. I'm offering. For the first time since she had arrived at his door, Sasha's composure faltered. Her hand clutched Malik's, her chest rising and falling as tears rolled freely now. Malik looked up at Daniel, his eyes wide and cautious. His small voice trembled as he asked, Are you going to send us away? Daniel crouched down so he was eye level with the boy, his voice gentler than Sasha had ever heard it. "No," he said softly. "No one's sending you anywhere." The boy's eyes welled with tears as he turned and threw his arms around Sasha's neck, burying his face against her. Daniel rose again, his jaw set, his heart pounding with a decision he knew could not be undone. "You gave up everything to protect me, Sasha," he said firmly. "It's my turn to protect you." And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the boy clinging to the woman who had once been his entire world, Daniel Carter made a silent vow. This time, he would not let her go. The hidden truth, the Digi. Night settled over the mansion like a heavy blanket, the storm outside pressing against the windows with relentless force. Rain hammered the glass, thunder rolled across the sky, and flashes of lightning carved shadows along the walls. But inside, in the quiet warmth of Daniel's home, there was another kind of storm, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Sasha sat at the edge of the guest bed where Malik had finally fallen asleep, his small body curled beneath the thick blankets, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a child finally safe enough to rest. For days, maybe weeks, he had known nothing but hunger, cold, and fear, and now the warmth of a clean bed had lulled him into the kind of sleep he had been starved of. Sasha brushed a hand across his forehead, her eyes lingering on the innocence of his face, and for a brief moment, the hardness she carried melted. In the doorway stood Daniel, silent, his tall frame outlined by the dim light of the hall. He had said nothing since showing them to the room, his expression unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind the mask he had perfected over the years. But as he watched Sasha lean over Malik, he felt a strange heaviness pressing against his chest. This was not the Sasha he remembered, the vibrant, confident woman who had once walked beside him with laughter in her voice and fire in her eyes. This was a woman who carried scars, both visible and invisible, a woman who had lived through battles he could not yet understand. And yet, despite everything, she still shielded Malik with a ferocity that spoke of love deeper than blood. "You should sleep," Daniel said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Sasha turned, startled, but quickly looked down again, her hand tightening over Malik's. "I'll stay until he's fully settled," she murmured. "He wakes sometimes and crying." Daniel stepped inside the room, his eyes falling briefly to the boy before shifting back to her. "He's safe here. No one will touch him." Her lips trembled faintly at his words, but she gave no reply. Instead, she adjusted the blanket one more time, and then rose slowly, her movements weary, her body thin and fragile in the soft light. Daniel caught the way her shoulders slumped, the way her hands shook slightly when she pressed them together. It was exhaustion, yes, but it was also something deeper, a burden carried too long, too heavy for any one person. They moved into the hallway, leaving the boy to rest, and Daniel closed the door softly behind them. He led her toward his study, the room that had been his sanctuary and his prison for years. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the shelves of books and the leather chairs. He gestured for her to sit, and for a moment she hesitated as though unsure whether she belonged here. But finally she lowered herself into one of the chairs, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel leaned against the desk, his gaze fixed on her. His voice came steady, but beneath it was the weight of years of questions that demanded answers. "Tell me everything. No more fragments, no more half-truths. I let you in. I gave you shelter. Now you owe me the truth." Sasha's breath caught, her eyes glistening as she stared into the flames. For a long moment she said nothing, the silence stretching until Daniel almost spoke again. Then her voice came, soft, raw, and filled with a pain that made his chest tighten. "My brother," she began, "was not the man he should have been. He made choices that destroyed everything around him. Drugs, debts, dangerous people. I tried to pull him back, but he was already too far gone. And when he saw me with you, saw the life you gave me, he thought he had found a way out. He wanted me to help him get to you. He wanted to use me to take your money." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And you refused." Her eyes flicked up to his for a brief moment before falling again. "Of course I refused. But they didn't care about what I wanted. They said if I didn't play along, they would make sure you paid anyway. Not with money, with your life. I thought they were bluffing at first. Until the night I found one of them outside your apartment. He was watching you, Daniel. Watching every move you made. That's when I knew they weren't lying. The only way to protect you was to disappear." Daniel's heart pounded as her words sank into him. The years of anger, of believing she had betrayed him, began to unravel in his chest, leaving something even heavier behind: guilt. "So you left without a word," he said, his voice hoarse. "You let me believe you didn't love me." Sasha's lips trembled. "If I had stayed, you'd be dead. And if I had told you, you would have come looking. You would have fought them and they would have killed you. I couldn't let that happen." Her voice broke now, and the tears she had been holding back slipped down her cheeks. "I thought I was saving you." Daniel turned away, running a hand through his hair, his chest burning. He wanted to be angry, to shout, to accuse her of taking away years of his life. But every time he looked at her face, at the hollow of her cheeks, the scars on her hands, the weight in her eyes, he saw nothing but sacrifice. She had given up everything, him, her own future, her own safety, just to protect him. "And Malik?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. Her hand instinctively moved to her lap, as though she could still feel the boy's small fingers there. "When my brother died, Malik was left with no one. I found him hiding in an abandoned house, cold, starving, terrified. He had no one else. I took him with me. He calls me Mom now because I'm all he knows. I couldn't let him suffer alone. He's my responsibility." Daniel's throat tightened as he pictured the boy, the way he had clung to her, the way he had devoured the bread at the table as though afraid it might vanish before he could finish. He looked back at Sasha, and for the first time he noticed the faint scar along her wrist, the mark at the edge of her collarbone peeking out from beneath her torn shirt. They weren't accidents. They were reminders of battles she had fought, of the cost she had paid for choosing to protect him and Malik. "You've been running all this time," Daniel said slowly, his voice heavy. She nodded. "Always moving, always hiding, never staying too long in one place, because I thought if they knew I was still alive, if they knew Malik was with me, they'd come after him too. I could live with them hurting me, Daniel. But not him." Daniel's chest ached at her words, a sharp pain that cut through the layers of stone he had built around his heart. He had once believed Sasha had abandoned him out of selfishness. Now, sitting before him was the truth. She had abandoned herself to save him, and in the process had carried a child through a nightmare no child deserved. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt the cold certainty of his empire tremble beneath his feet. This was no longer about betrayal or anger. This was about a woman who had bled for him in silence, and a boy who deserved a chance at life. And as he looked at Sasha through the flickering light of the fire, he realized that the truth he had uncovered was not just about the past. It was about the responsibility now placed on his shoulders. "You don't have to run anymore," he said again, firmer this time, his voice steady with conviction. "Not from me. Not from anyone." Sasha's eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw both fear and hope, two forces battling for space in the heart of a woman who had carried two, much for too long. And in that fragile moment, Daniel understood that their story had not ended 7 years ago. It had only been waiting in silence, waiting for this night, waiting for him to choose whether he would finally fight for her, the way she had once fought for him. Shelter in storms. The mansion was quiet the next morning, but it was not the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on the air, heavy with unsaid words and unspoken fears. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind clear skies and damp earth. But inside Daniel Carter's world, a different storm was only beginning. He walked the long hallway in silence, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. his mind weighed down by the conversations of the night before. Every sentence Sasha had spoken replayed in his head. The threats, the sacrifices, the years of fear she had endured, and with each memory his anger burned hotter. Not at her, but at the men who had forced her to vanish, who had turned her into a ghost of the woman she once was. When he reached the guest wing, he paused at the door that led into the room where Sasha and Malik slept. He didn't knock. Instead, he stood for a long moment listening. From inside came the faint murmur of Sasha's voice, soft and gentle, and the lighter sound of Malik's laughter. It was a fragile sound, hesitant at first, but laughter nonetheless. A sound that carried warmth even in its weakness. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. For 7 years, this house had known nothing but silence, its halls echoing only with his footsteps and the quiet hum of machinery. Now, with one boy's laugh, the mansion felt alive again, if only faintly. Inside, Sasha sat at the edge of the bed, brushing Malik's hair with her fingers as he showed her something he had drawn on a scrap of paper Daniel had left on the nightstand. A shaky picture of a house with 2 stick figures standing beside a smaller one. Sasha smiled faintly at it, her eyes glistening with a mix of pride and sadness. Daniel finally knocked softly and stepped inside. "You're awake early," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Sasha looked up, startled, then nodded. He couldn't sleep long. He's not used to beds anymore. She smoothed Malik's hair again. "But he'll adjust." Malik looked up at Daniel, his wide eyes cautious but curious. For a moment, Daniel only looked back at him, then finally forced a small smile. "You're safe here," he said gently. The boy gave a tiny nod, then pressed closer to Sasha's side, clutching his drawing tightly. Daniel's gaze shifted back to Sasha. "Come downstairs when you're ready. Breakfast is waiting." Down in the dining room, the table was laid with more food than Sasha had seen in weeks: eggs, fruit, warm bread, and fresh juice. Malik's eyes widened at the sight, and Daniel caught the boy's hesitation as though he didn't know if it was really meant for him. Sasha whispered softly, "It's okay, baby. Eat." And Malik did. This time without the trembling desperation of the night before, but still with the hunger of someone who had gone without for far too long. As they ate, Daniel sat across from them, his fingers laced together, his eyes fixed on Sasha. "I made some calls last night," he said finally, his voice low. "The men your brother was involved with, they're not gone. Not completely. Pieces of that world still exist. People who would have reason to come after you. Or him." His gaze flicked to Malik. Sasha froze, the fork halfway to her lips. Her hands shook as she set it down. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it wasn't over." Daniel leaned forward. "It won't be easy, but I can end this. I have resources, Sasha. I can protect you now." Her lips parted, her eyes filling with both fear and defiance. "You don't know what they're capable of. You think money can solve everything, but these men, they don't stop, they don't forgive, they don't forget." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then they picked the wrong people to haunt." His voice was sharp now, the edge of a man who had built empires and destroyed enemies in boardrooms around the world. "I won't let them take anything else from you." Sasha lowered her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She hated herself for the flicker of relief that washed over her at his words. For so long, she had carried everything alone. And now, hearing him claim the fight as his own, she felt the weight shift slightly off her shoulders, but fear remained, deep and gnawing. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've spent years running because I knew the moment I stopped, the moment I let him be seen, they would find us." Her hand reached across the table to grip Malik's arm. "And I can't lose him." Daniel looked at her, and for a moment he saw not the woman who had once left him, but the woman who had kept him alive. Her strength was undeniable, but so was her exhaustion. She had fought battles she never should have fought alone, and for the first time in years, Daniel Carter's heart cracked wide enough to let someone else in. The day passed quietly, with Small moments that felt almost fragile in their simplicity. Malik explored the garden, his small hands reaching for flowers he had never seen before, his laughter echoing through the courtyard. Sasha watched him from the terrace, her eyes soft but her posture tense, as though she expected the world to snatch him away at any moment. Daniel stood nearby, silent, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the boy. He was seeing more than a child. He was seeing the cost of every decision Sasha had made, the life she had chosen to save at the expense of her own. Later that night, when the house had quieted again, Daniel found himself outside the guest room, once more. Through the crack of the door, he saw Sasha sitting by the window, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. She was not asleep. Instead, her eyes were distant, her shoulders hunched, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt, so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was the posture of someone who had never learned how to rest, someone who carried her battles into the night because she knew daylight would only bring more. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had long forgotten: helplessness. He could buy companies, silence enemies, and command entire industries. But here, in his own house, sat a woman who had given up everything for him and who now carried wounds deeper than he could reach. He wanted to fix it, to offer her the kind of peace she deserved. But he knew peace was not something money could buy. It had to be earned, brick by brick, moment by moment. As he stood there, he whispered a vow so quiet it was meant only for himself. "This time, Sasha, you won't fight alone, not anymore." And in that vow, as the night settled once more over the mansion, the storm within Daniel Carter began to turn. Not one of anger and betrayal, but of resolve. He had let her vanish once. He would not let her vanish again. The world outside. The following morning dawned brighter than any day before. The storm had washed the city clean, leaving the air crisp, the sky painted in soft shades of gold, and the streets gleaming with rainwater that reflected the light like mirrors. Daniel Carter stood by the window of his study, watching the day unfold. For years, mornings had been meaningless to him, a blur of schedules and meetings, each day identical to the last. But today, he felt the weight of expectation. Not the kind that came from business partners or shareholders, but the kind that came from the two people sleeping in the guest wing of his house, Sasha and Malik. Their presence had shifted something inside him, something he had long thought dead. When he walked into the dining room, he found Sasha already awake, her hair tied back in a loose braid, Malik perched beside her at the table. The boy's cheeks were fuller already after just 2 days of eating properly, and his wide eyes sparkled with a brightness Daniel had not seen before. He clutched a piece of toast in one hand and pointed excitedly at the birds outside the window with the other. Sasha smiled faintly at his joy, but Daniel caught the exhaustion still clinging to her eyes, the way her shoulders never fully relaxed. She was always listening, always bracing for a knock at the door as though the world would never let her rest. "Would you like to go out today?" Daniel asked suddenly, his voice softer than his usual businesslike tone. Sasha looked up, startled, as though she had misheard him. Malik froze mid-bite, his small face lighting up with curiosity. "Out?" Sasha repeated, her voice cautious. "Yes," Daniel said, nodding once. "The city, the park, anywhere Malik wants to see. He deserves more than walls and fear." Sasha hesitated, glancing at the boy who was now staring at her with hope written across his face. She had spent years teaching him to hide, to keep his head down, to live in the shadows. The thought of taking him into the open, where eyes might notice, where enemies might find them, made her chest tighten with panic. But when she saw the light in his eyes, she realized she could not cage him forever. Slowly she nodded. "All right. But only if we stay together." Malik nearly jumped from his chair in excitement, clapping his small hands. For the first time, Daniel saw him look like the child he was meant to be, not the survivor of too many nights of hunger. That sight alone made Daniel's decision feel right. Later, they walked together through the city, Malik sandwiched between them, his small hands holding tightly onto Sasha's and Daniel's. The boy's laughter rose above the noise of the streets as he marveled at everything. The tall buildings, the street musicians, the ice cream cart where Daniel bought him his first cone. Malik's eyes widened with delight as the cold sweetness touched his tongue, and Sasha smiled faintly at his joy, though her gaze kept flicking nervously over her shoulder, scanning the crowd. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. "No one's going to hurt you," he said quietly, leaning closer as they strolled. "You don't know that," she whispered back, her voice sharp with fear. "You don't know who might be watching." And as if summoned by her words, the truth struck him only moments later. A camera flash, quick and subtle, from the corner of the street, then another. At first he thought it was coincidence. He was, after all, one of the most recognizable men in the country. Paparazzi followed him everywhere, but this felt different. The cameras weren't just on him, they were on her, on Malik. By the time they returned to the mansion, Daniel's phone was buzzing with alerts. Headlines were already spreading. Billionaire Daniel Carter seen with unknown woman and child. Mystery family. Photographs showed him walking with Sasha and Malik, their hands linked together. The images were already everywhere. Speculation. Running wild. Sasha saw the screen when Daniel set it on the table, and her face drained of color. Her hands shook violently as she clutched the edge of the chair. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this can't be happening. They'll know, they'll see us, they'll come." Malik, sensing her fear, pressed himself against her side, his small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. "Mom," he whispered, confusion heavy in his voice. Daniel's jaw tightened, fury flashing in his eyes. He crouched in front of them, his voice firm, unwavering. "Listen to me, no one is going to touch you. Not the press, not the men from your past, no one. You're safe here, Sasha. I will not let them take this from you again." But Sasha shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "You don't understand, Daniel. Once they see us, once they know I'm alive, they won't stop. They'll come for him. They'll come for Malik." Her hands gripped the boy's arms protectively. "I can't lose him." Daniel reached out, his hand covering hers, steadying the trembling that wouldn't stop. His voice was low, but the fire in it was undeniable. "You won't lose him. You won't lose anything, I promise you, Sasha. This time it's different, this time I fight back." For a long moment, the room was filled only with the sound of Sasha's ragged breaths, Malik's quiet whimper, and the faint hum of the city outside. Then, slowly, she looked into Daniel's eyes, searching for the man she once knew. The man she had loved before fear had torn them apart, and what she saw there made her heart falter. It was not just anger, it was resolve. The same resolve that had built his empire, now turned toward her and the boy she loved. That night, as Malik finally drifted to sleep in his new bed, Sasha stood at the window of the guest room, staring out at the city lights. Daniel joined her, silent at first, his presence strong beside her. "They'll come," she said softly, almost to herself. "Let them," Daniel replied, his voice hard as steel. "This time I'll be waiting." And in that moment, with the world outside closing in and the danger drawing nearer, the mansion no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like the beginning of a battleground. The breaking point. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension, like the quiet before a storm. The photographs of Daniel, Sasha, and Malik had spread across newspapers, television, and online headlines. Everywhere people speculated. Was this Daniel's secret family, a hidden relationship, a mystery child? Daniel's world had always been one of scrutiny, but now the attention was not just on him. It was on Sasha, and more dangerously, it was on Malik. Every article, every blurred picture was another flare in the night, and Daniel knew that the wrong people would see it too. Inside the mansion, Sasha moved like a woman carrying both gratitude and terror. She cooked small meals in the kitchen, folded Malik's clothes, tried to bring normality to their days, but her eyes were never calm. She would pause suddenly at sounds in the hallway, glance twice at the windows, flinch when the phone rang. Daniel noticed all of it, and though he told her again and again, "You are safe here," he understood that safety was a fragile word to someone who had lived in fear for 7 years. It happened on a Friday evening. The mansion was quieter than usual. Daniel had dismissed most of the staff, not trusting anyone completely after the media storm. Sasha was in the living room, helping Malik with a puzzle on the floor, her laughter soft as she encouraged him, her fingers gently guiding his small hands. For a fleeting moment, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a picture of a family he had never dared to imagine. But then the sound came. A dull, heavy thud at the gates outside. Then another. Then voices. Daniel rose sharply, his instincts honed not just from business but from the sense that this moment had been coming. He moved to the security screens on the wall. 3 men stood outside the gates, their faces partially hidden, their posture rough, impatient, dangerous. They weren't paparazzi. They weren't reporters. These were men who carried the shadows of Sasha's past in their eyes. Sasha's head lifted immediately, her body tensing. She knew before Daniel even spoke. "They've found us. Stay here," Daniel ordered, his voice firm. But she shook her head violently, pulling Malik against her. "No, they want him. They always want the one thing they can use to break you." Her arms wrapped around the boy tightly, her voice breaking. "I won't let them take him." Daniel's heart pounded. He pressed the intercom, his voice low and controlled. "Leave. Now." The men only laughed, their voices crackling through the speaker. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you, Carter. Hand over the boy, and we'll leave you breathing." Sasha's face went white. Malik whimpered softly against her chest. Daniel's fists clenched, a fury rising in him so strong he felt it burn through his veins. For years he had fought battles of numbers, contracts, and power. But this was different. This was primal. This was about Sasha. This was about Malik. He turned to her, his voice iron. "Take him upstairs. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Her lips trembled as she clutched Malik tighter. "Daniel, do it," he said, softer now but with a fire that left no room for doubt. She hesitated only a second before pulling Malik up into her arms and rushing toward the stairs, whispering reassurances in the boy's ear even as her own body shook. Daniel watched them disappear, then turned back to the monitors. The men had begun rattling the gates, one of them pulling something from his jacket. Within minutes, Daniel's private security, men he trusted, men who owed him loyalty, not for pay but for their lives, moved into position. The confrontation was short but sharp, voices raised, weapons brandished, fists clashing in the cold night air. Daniel stepped outside at the height of it, his presence like a blade slicing through the chaos. The men saw him and sneered. "Still protecting her, Carter? After all these years?" Daniel's voice cut back, low and dangerous. "I wasn't there last time. I am now." The fight that followed was not the kind Daniel was used to, but he stood in it with the same resolve he had once used to build his empire. His men overpowered the intruders, dragging them to the ground, disarming them, breaking the threats they carried. But the words the men shouted as they were forced into waiting cars cut deep into Daniel's ears. "She'll never be free. They'll keep coming. She's poison, Carter. She'll ruin you too." When the gates finally closed again and silence fell, Daniel stood in the dark driveway, his breath heavy, his heart pounding with a rage that refused to settle. For the first time, he realized the full truth of what Sasha had carried all these years. This wasn't just fear. This was reality. These men, and the ones still hidden in the shadows, would never have stopped until they had destroyed everything she touched. And yet she had carried it alone. For him. Inside, Sasha had locked herself in the upstairs room. She was sitting on the floor, Malik in her arms, rocking him gently as tears slid silently down her cheeks. She whispered over and over, "It's okay, baby. I won't let them take you. I won't let them." But her own body betrayed the lie. Her hands shook. Her breath trembled. Her strength was fraying. When Daniel entered, she looked up, her eyes wide with fear. Is it over? For now, he said, his voice heavy but steady. Her lips quivered. It will never be over. Don't you see? I ruined your life just by stepping on your doorstep. I should have stayed away. Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her, his hand cupping her face firmly. His voice broke, fierce with conviction. No, you didn't ruin my life, Sasha. You gave me one. You gave me a reason to fight. Do you think I care about the risks? I care about you, about him, about what they took from us and what they will never take again. Her tears spilled faster now as she shook her head. Daniel. No, he said, cutting her off. You saved me once. You gave up everything to protect me. Tonight proved one thing. I should have been the one protecting you. And I swear, to you, Sasha, I won't fail again. For a long moment she stared at him, her breath catching, her heart torn between fear and the truth shining in his eyes. And in that fragile silence, Malik, still clinging to her, looked at Daniel with wide trembling eyes. Are you my dad now? He asked softly, his voice innocent and raw. The question shattered the last wall inside Daniel. His throat tightened, his eyes burning. He reached out, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. If you'll let me be, he whispered. Malik nodded faintly, then pressed himself against Sasha again, his small body trembling, but his heart settling at Daniel's words. That night, as the house finally quieted and Malik slept between them, Sasha lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind still reeling from the terror, the relief, and the impossible hope blooming in her chest. Daniel sat beside the bed, refusing to leave, his eyes never leaving her face. He had made his choice, and she knew it. The man she had once loved was no longer just a memory. He was here, and he was ready to fight. But even as she drifted into exhausted sleep, one truth lingered in her chest. The war was not over. The worst was still to come. Redemption and renewal the night after the attack did not bring rest. Though Malik slept soundly, cradled in safety for the first time in years, Daniel and Sasha remained awake, their minds heavy with everything that had happened. Sasha sat by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the distant city lights as though she could see the shadows moving there. Daniel stood behind her, silent, his hands gripping the back of a chair, his jaw set with a resolve she had seen before in the man who built empires, but now it burned for something more than profit or power. It burned for her, for Malik, for the family that had been stolen from him once and that he refused to lose again. When morning came, Daniel was already on the phone, his voice low and dangerous as he issued orders. For years, his wealth had built walls of comfort and luxury. Now it would build a shield, a weapon, a fortress. I want names, he said sharply. Every last one of them. The men who came here, the men who sent them, and anyone left who thinks they can touch what's mine. Find them. End this. His words were not shouted, but they carried a finality that made the men on the other end of the line obey without hesitation. Sasha watched him, torn between gratitude and fear. Gratitude because no one had ever stood so firmly for her. Fear because she knew what these men were capable of. Daniel, she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't know what you're walking into. These people, they don't care who they destroy. They'll drag you down too. Daniel turned, his eyes locking onto hers with a fire that made her breath catch. They already tried to drag me down, Sasha. When they took you away from me. When they left you with nothing. When they forced a child to starve in abandoned houses. I let them steal 7 years from us. That ends today. This time I fight back. Her lips parted, her throat tightening, but no words came. Deep inside, she felt something she had long buried. A flicker of hope, faint but alive. Over the days that followed, Daniel's world shifted into a war room. His mansion became a fortress guarded by men he trusted with his life. His investigators traced the remnants of the network Sasha's brother had once been tied to. Slowly, piece by piece, the empire of shadows began to crumble under the weight of Daniel's relentless pursuit. Accounts were frozen, leaders exposed, Safe houses raided. The men who had hunted Sasha found themselves hunted in return, stripped of power, driven into corners where they could no longer reach her. But even as victory drew closer, fear clung to Sasha. One evening, as she tucked Malik into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Are the bad men gone now, Mom?" The word Mom made her chest ache with both love and pain. She brushed his hair back gently, her voice steady for his sake. "Soon, baby. Very soon." But when she left his room, her composure broke, and Daniel found her standing in the hallway, tears sliding silently down her face. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered when he touched her arm. "For so long, all I've known is running. I don't know how to stop." Daniel turned her gently toward him, his hand steady on her cheek. "Then let me teach you," he said softly. "Let me give you back what they stole." For the first time in years, Sasha let herself lean into him, her forehead resting against his chest, his arms closed around her, strong and certain, and she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Late one night, as the city slept, Daniel's men intercepted the last group of those who had threatened Sasha. Unlike before, Daniel did not simply watch from a distance. He stood there, face to face with the man who had once ordered Sasha's disappearance. The man sneered, mocking him, spitting words about weakness and love. But Daniel did not waver. His voice was calm, steady, unshakable. "You had your chance to scare her. You had your chance to chase her. It's over. You don't own her. You don't own him. And you will never touch them again." The man laughed, but it was short-lived. Daniel's power was no longer only his wealth. It was the network he commanded, the loyalty he inspired, the walls he had built around Sasha and Malik. And that night, as the last pieces of that shadowed world fell apart, Daniel knew it was not just an end. It was a beginning. When he returned home, Sasha was waiting. The fear in her eyes melted when she saw the certainty in his. "It's done," he said simply. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely as her knees nearly buckled. Daniel caught her, holding her close. "You don't have to run anymore," he whispered against her hair. "Not ever again." In the days that followed, life began to take a new shape. Malik laughed more freely, his small hands no longer trembling when he held Daniel's. He ran through the gardens, his joy echoing across the mansion's walls, filling them with life. Sasha slowly began to smile again, though the scars of the past would always remain. And Daniel, the man who had once lived in silence and solitude, found himself surrounded by the sounds of family. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Malik climbed into Daniel's lap, his wide eyes bright with innocence. He looked up at him, then at Sasha, and asked the question that made her heart stop. "Can we stay here forever?" Daniel's throat tightened, his arms wrapping around the boy. He looked at Sasha, whose lips trembled as tears glistened in her eyes. And he answered without hesitation, "Yes, Malik. Forever." The boy smiled, pressing his small head against Daniel's chest. In that moment, Sasha reached across, her fingers lacing with Daniel's. He squeezed her hand gently, and in that touch, everything was said. The years of pain, the sacrifices, the fear, it all led here, to this moment of quiet redemption. That night, as Daniel tucked Malik into bed and kissed his forehead, the boy whispered softly, "Good night, Dad." The word struck Daniel like lightning, not with pain, but with a warmth so fierce it nearly broke him. He stepped out of the room with tears in his eyes, and when Sasha met him in the hallway, he didn't hide them. "You've already saved us," she whispered. He shook his head softly, pulling her into his arms. "No, Sasha, you saved me. And now I finally know what I was meant to do with all of this," he said, gesturing to the mansion, the wealth, the empire he had built. "It wasn't to build an empire for myself. It was to protect you, to protect him, to give us a family." For the first time in years, Sasha let herself believe it. She rested her head against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heart calming the storms that had raged within her for so long. Together with Malik safe between them, they stood not as people haunted by the past, but as a family finally stepping into the light of tomorrow. And as the night settled peacefully over the Carter estate, Daniel made a vow in his heart. A vow stronger than any business deal, stronger than any empire he had ever built. Never again would he let her carry her battles alone. Never again would Malik go hungry or afraid. This was his family now, his reason, his redemption.